Well, it's a great pleasure and welcome. And it's also a great pleasure actually just to introduce David to Ted and Ted to David, because I hadn't realized they had never met before. And I think this would be both a good conversation, but I suspect one that will go beyond this evening. So the book is loaded with dynamite, unintended consequences of Woodrow Wilson's idealism. And it's just a remarkable book. It's a wonderful book. I think well described by Steve Kinzer, who said Greenway makes a persuasive case that Wilson's well-meaning idealism wound up igniting conflicts that had troubled the world for more than a century. But Ingrid, who's a book designer, also took part of the other quote and put it on the cover, and also from Steve Kinzer in this particular case, which is a wild adventure. Italian pirates, Moroccan warlords, and Chinese revolutionaries shape a grand narrative of rising nationalism and anti-colonial passion. So it's far beyond a dry history. It's got just a lot of just drive to it, but it's also really a pretty important history, I think, and timely as we look at Haiti, we look at the Taliban trying to form a government, but then there's Estonia. It's a complicated situation of how countries form, and that may be part of the conversation. So Ted Widmer, who was here, I think a little less than a year, but a while ago with Lincoln on the Verge, this really super well-reviewed book, 13 Days to Washington, about Lincoln's travel by train from Illinois to Washington. And he's sort of an historian for all seasons. He's written and edited 10 books on American history, but he also served as a speechwriter to Bill Clinton, and also later a senior advisor to Hillary Clinton at the State Department. So he's seen history being made, the sausage making go forward. He's a professor at the Macaulay Honors College at the City University of New York, and adjunct professor at Brown, the advisor, I believe, to Van Gregorian at the Carnegie Endowment. Also a former head of the John Carter Brown Library. I can assure you he has no lack of humor. I hope he'll control it today. But anyway, he was the editor of one of the editors of the Harvard Lampoon, and he can be seen at various rock and roll venues throughout New England, still keeping up and playing. David Greenway is really one of the most distinguished foreign correspondents. He's somebody who's worked on pretty much every level you could work on, really beginning on the ground. And so he's visited 96 countries as a reporter. Vietnam was there behind enemy lines, as well as right in the midst of things, Jerusalem, Afghanistan, and the like. So he has a very granular sense of how reporting is done, and in a certain sense, how history is begun. But he's also somebody who was in his columns as a columnist for the Boston Globe and head of the op-ed page, very tuned in to the politics that are going, not just in terms of what was happening literally on the ground, but what was happening a layer or two up, but also a fascination with history. And I think he wrote I know he wrote a wonderful book because I read it on The Foreign Correspondent, about his life as a correspondent, but also this book is a book of history. And so the relationship between history and time, not because it just mechanically predicts the future, but it obviously sets context, is very important. And clearly what happens in the political is very important, but what happens on the ground. So that's, and he's been at this for a number of years, and he's got a pretty rare perspective. It actually began, if I correct me, David, when you were at Oxford and you were a stringer, I think, for the Time magazine.
That's
and
right.
Came down to visit Henry Luce, the great Henry Luce. And one of Henry Luce's penetrating questions was, what class did you come down on the train? And you told him you came just normal class, tourist class. And he looked askance and said, Time magazine, only go first class. So that wasn't possible in Vietnam. But anyway, I think it's a great combination to have the two conversation. There's a cliche that says that journalism is the first draft of history, and that's obviously something that David has been in the forefront. But I think journalism, to a certain extent, is becoming the first tweet of history, not necessarily as thoughtful and involved with it. So I think it's just great to have the two of you together. And Ted, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Jock and Joe. And thanks a year later for hosting a night about my book. I really appreciated it. And I'm just so thrilled to be a part of tonight's talk about David's book. I loved it. I'm glad my enthusiastic blurb did not disqualify me from being an interviewer this evening. It was just very exciting. And I thought I'd begin, David, by asking you, how long was this book germinating for you? Were you thinking about Wilson in 1919 and all those years you were in the trenches, I guess literally, but and places of conflict like Vietnam and the Middle East? Were you thinking about that long ago history way back then?
Maybe not that far back, but one of the things that impressed me when I got to Vietnam was, while we were looking at this struggle as between communism and non-communists, many and perhaps most Vietnamese were looking at it in terms of the anti-colonial struggle. And it began to dawn on me that we in the West were obsessed with anti-communism, but most of the world was trying to get rid of colonialism. And to me, the last half of the 20th century was really the struggle to get rid of empires, the Western empires. And you might say that struggle continued until the 15th of August this year, when we left Kabul in a hurry.
Well, your title is so inviting and exciting, but I think it gets at a problem that most Americans are not aware of, that the rhetoric, which sounds simple, we all agree with it, spreading democracy, spreading self-determination, is dynamite. That when Wilson started talking that way in 1917 and 18, and especially 1919, the world really woke up with consequences that Wilson and a lot of other people did not quite intend. So can you talk about the danger of promising democracy to people?
Well, that quote, the title comes from his Wilson's Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, who recognized that this was going to be or could be trouble, because Wilson was who was preeminent in the world. I mean, this was a moment when World War I ended that no American has had before or since. Wilson was the most beloved and important man in the world. And everybody was looking, after this catastrophe of World War I, they were looking to Wilson as the messiah of a new world, a new order. And not only the Allies, the British and the French, but the Germans and the Austrians, and were looking to him too as bringing the world out of this disaster and preventing another world war. So his moment, maybe if Roosevelt had lived, he could have had the same position at the end of World War II, but Roosevelt didn't live. Mm-hmm. But and Lansing realized that these promises, because all through the war, Wilson been making these pronouncements. The famous 14 points is the best known, but then there were the 4 principles and his 4 ends and all these different statements. He, like Jove sending thunderbolts down from heaven. And Lansing asked the question, when the president talks of self-determination, what unit does he have in mind? Does he mean a race, a territorial area, or a community? The phrase is simply loaded with dynamite. It will raise hopes that can never be realized. And I think that turned out to be true. And the difficulty of what you mean by self-determination, Wilson never came to grips with that, really. He liked the lofty ideas, but he wasn't interested in the details.
Would you agree that self-determination was a pretty successful concept in Europe, where white people living under former empires were reorganizing countries, some small countries that succeeded? but that it really did not work very well far away from Europe, and partly because of the lack of interest of Wilson in
Well,
seeing.
exactly. Wilson meant self-determination for Europe and the Ottoman Empire. He never wanted to break up anybody's colonial empire. And as a matter of fact, he was so fixated on the League of Nations, which was his baby, that he wouldn't interfere with the British or the French or the Japanese for fear of losing their support for the League of Nations. So he was only interested in Europe. But even then, it was very hard to determine. You take one of the chapters in the book is about Fiume. And there it had an Italian, the center of town, but all the suburbs were Croatian and the greater area was all Croatian. So when you said self-determination, did it mean just the city center or the territory? And that's what Wilson, so even in Europe, it was very hard to determine.
So since you mentioned Fiume, how did you find D'Annunzio? He's absolutely fascinating character, a poet and a politician and a soldier, almost a theatrical soldier more than a real, but just so interesting. And I had studied a fair amount of World War I and never came across him. And I just enjoyed that part of your book so much.
Well, the gold standard on that is if anybody's interested in learning more about him, is Lucy Hughes Hallett's The Pike. And it's a full study of D'Annunzio. I got interested in him a little earlier than that, in the sense of when I first visited Yugoslavia, and I came across the name of D'Annunzio and then looked into it, and here he was, the best known poet in Europe, and yet this astonishing other side to him. And in the end, although he was never a fascist, as Lucy Hughes Hallett said, fascism was D'Annunzian.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all the trappings of fascism, the straight arm salute, the rallies, the torchlight parades. He was called Duce even before Mussolini, but Mussolini copied all his mannerisms, and Hitler copied them from Mussolini.
Mm.
So you see even though he was never a fascist, you kind of see the birth of fascism in D'Annunzio.
Would he have been more like Mussolini if he had been a better soldier, do you think? I mean, he only really ever controlled Fiume, but if he'd won more battles on the battlefield, would he have made fascism part of his style of governing?
No, I don't think he would ever have gone that far. And the kind of state that Mussolini presided over was not D'Annunzio. But the kind of malignant narcissism that fascism produced certainly started with D'Annunzio. Mm. And but he saw himself as more of a Nietzschean Superman. He talked about the politics of poetry, but it was really only the politics of narcissism. But the rallies, the Trump's rallies, and the responses, lock her up, mm-hmm. That's pure D'Annunzio.
So interesting.
That's what he started, and he would organize these rallies and have these responses, chants, that all go straight back to D'Annunzio. I don't think Trump knows that, but that's the origins.
Well, and you've also got this fascinating thread of Islamic nationalism with, do we say Abd el-Krim? Is that how you?
Abd el-Krim. Yes.
That I didn't know about him either, and that was absolutely riveting. And so how did you come across him, and what is his lingering influence on the 21st century?
I got interested in him from reading about Morocco. And to me, he represents the anti-colonial, one of the first instances of a successful, at least for a while, anti-colonial revolt. And I believe he was influenced by Wilson, and indeed his foreign minister in his Republic of the Rif almost quotes Wilson. But he was before his time. The colonial world would have to wait till another world war before they'd be free. But el-Krim, Abdul el-Krim, had his own country with his own flag and his own ministers, but nobody in the world would recognize him. And he hoped that Wilson's talk about self-determination meant that some country would recognize it, but it never happened. And in fact, the colonial powers were terrified because he made it possible that maybe colonialism wasn't so good and wouldn't work, and it might encourage other people to rise up. But for 5 or 6 years, he had his own country.
I was very struck by how long these quasi-countries lasted. They weren't just a month or two, they were 5 or 6, well into the 1920s.
Yes, I think it was 1926 was the end of the Republic of the Rif. But no one today knows about him. But he was one of the most famous guys in the world. He was on the cover of Time magazine. Sigmund Romberg wrote a musical about him, The Desert Song, even though the Rif is mountainous and not desert, but never mind. There've been 4 Hollywood movies about him.
Wow.
And yet nobody knows him today. But he represented, to me, the beginnings of the anti-colonial struggle that came to culmination after World War II.
And is there a legacy for el-Krim among Egyptian nationalists, Iraqi nationalists, other Arab nationalists of the later?
Everybody looked up to him. And as a matter of fact, so did Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh, because he was a master at guerrilla warfare, a military genius. And he knew exactly how to attack where the Spanish were weak and retreat where the Spanish was strong. And it was just classic guerrilla tactics. And he was very, very good at it.
Well, since you mentioned Mao, it's natural to turn to Sun Yat-sen, who is just such an interesting and complex Chinese ancestor, because he's the ancestor of the Taiwanese leadership and the Beijing leadership, and they don't like each other, but they all revere Sun Yat-sen, who, like Barack Obama, was educated in Hawaii, and I just am grateful to you for bringing him back to my attention. What a fascinating early 20th century figure.
Well, exactly, because that all Chinese, the communists and non-communists, should look up to him as the father of modern China is interesting. And he went to the same school as Obama in Hawaii.
Is that right?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Has Obama ever acknowledged that fact?
If he has, I don't know about it. But Sun Yat-sen was such a figure of his time. He spent his whole career first organizing revolts against the emperor. And when the empire fell in 1911, he became the first provisional president of the Republic of China. But then China fell to pieces with warlords and different parts of China breaking off and going their own way. And he spent the latter part of his life trying to organize and fight to unify China again, to bring it together.
Were there other people inspired by Wilson that you considered putting front and center? I mean, I think your triumvirate works extremely well, but were there other people you thought about and didn't include at the last moment?
Well, if I did, I didn't go very far with them. These were the three I was interested in, because I think the two decisions at the peace conference, the decision not to give Italy Fiume, which it wanted, even though Italy was part of the Big Four and an ally, it was very consequential. But even more so, Wilson's decision not to give the Shandong Peninsula back to China, the consequences are still going on today.
Right.
You can draw a straight line from that decision in 1919 to the split between China and America today. Because when the news got back to China of what Wilson had done, there were riots all over China. Students paraded and caused trouble, and it launched the May 4th movement. May 4th being the day in 1919 that the news got back to China. And the May 4th movement was a re-examining of what China really was, what modern things China should accept, what should they discard, a whole re-examining of Chinese society as never before. And Wilson had been very much admired among intellectuals in China. Sun Yat-sen sent him a telegram after the end of the war and said what a wonderful thing he'd done. But then after the May 4th movement and after this betrayal to let the Chinese keep, what had happened was the Germans had taken Shandong in 1897, part of the colonial takeover. And Shandong was where Confucius was born and the kind of cultural heartland of China. And the Japanese joined the Allies in World War I and took it away from the Germans. A secret treaty between Britain and France allowed them to stay. But Wilson didn't like secret treaties. He was against them. It's one of the 14 points. But he went along. It should have gone back to China. Everybody knew that. All of Wilson's principles of self-determination, and easy to define. There was no mixed population in Shandong like there was in Fiume. There was no doubt which people we were talking about. It should have gone back to China. But he let it go to Japan because he wanted Japan in the United Nations, in the League of Nations. And from that moment, Chinese intellectuals began to look towards Russia as an anti-colonial power. And in just 100 years ago this summer, the Communist Party starts in China. Sun Yat-sen makes an alliance with the Communist Party. And from that moment on, Chinese thought began to look more towards communism than towards Wilson's ideals.
Mhm. I wonder if you could help me with a problem I have as a teacher of American history. I really struggle to explain Woodrow Wilson to students. He's not doing very well in the media. He's dismissed all the time, and correctly in many cases for the failure of his foreign policy, or specifically failure to get the treaty through the Senate. But also we know a lot more than we used to about the racism of his domestic policies. At the same time, it feels to me a little bit shallow to just dismiss him, because he was very important. And your book captures the real excitement of his ideas. Although, as you say, with the phrase loaded with dynamite, they weren't easily controlled. But the idea of ending colonial empires and giving people the right to govern themselves was an idea most of us can get on board with. So I really struggle with how to talk about Wilson to young people today.
Well, I don't think there is any American president that's fallen so far from grace. Princeton University, where he was president, you can't even, everything is, all the Wilson, his name is taken off everything, the Wilson Center for, but I think this goes a little too far. He was a deeply flawed man, but he also had, in many ways, he was a visionary. The League of Nations failed, but the idea that we needed some kind of international body to settle disputes didn't die with Wilson. Roosevelt, who was in Paris at the time, I think understood what needed to be done with the United Nations, not to make the same mistakes as the League of Nations. Mm-hmm. And it can't solve all the problems, but certainly the world needs the United Nations. And Wilson foresaw that without some kind of international body, there'd be a second World War worse than the first. And he was absolutely right about that. And the efforts now to completely discredit him. Yes, he was a racist, but he was other things too. And I think just to dismiss him for his faults he was a complicated, interesting man with good points and bad points, like most human beings.
Well, thank you, David. That's really helpful. And I mean, that tracks with my feelings. I don't like to just get on the bandwagon of attacking him, which seems to be the current trend. I think he's more complicated and more interesting than that. And he had a tragic end of his own, as you know very well, with his collapse while trying to persuade the American people to override the Senate and approve the League of Nations. And so, I mean, it's almost Shakespearean, the whole story.
Yes, it is. I had thought of that. And Sun Yat-sen had, I think, the last word on him. Sun Yat-sen said that Wilson's proposals, once set forth, could not be recalled. The colonized people of the world had been doomed to disappointment by the results of the peace conference, but they began independently and separately to carry out the principles of self-determination. And I think that, and this was Wilson's true legacy.
That's beautifully put.
And that's Sun Yat-sen.
Well, Jock and Joe, maybe that's a good moment to open it up to questions. But thank you, David. That's so well put.
Excellent. I think that's a great idea. That was wonderful. It was so great to eavesdrop on your conversation. How fabulous. And so yeah, so if anybody, I'm checking the chat and I'm not seeing anything there. So I think that people, if you would like to just unmute yourself and speak up, ask a question, make a comment, that would be fantastic. Let's see.
I might just add one thing. It was Steve Kinzer who came up with the title. He saw that I had quoted Lansing in the book. Originally, I was going to call it The Tragedy of Disappointment. That was a phrase that came from Wilson when he was about to leave for the peace conference. He said, I hope that everything I said doesn't end up as a tragedy of disappointment, which of course it did. But Steve pointed out that Tragedy of Disappointment was not a good title for a book. And Loaded with Dynamite was much better. And he was absolutely right.
Excellent. So Elise, did I see your hand up? Yes.
I had a couple of things I wanted to say. I just finished the book prior to joining you, and I loved it. And there were so many things in it I had never even heard of, like the Rift Republic in Morocco and Fiume. And despite all my college history and poli-sci courses, I never knew anything about those things. So I think I'm going to send it to my best friend from first grade who was in the Peace Corps in Morocco.
Oh, good.
Quite a few years ago. And I had a couple of questions. The first was about the secret treaties. I assume those were secret from the US, but were they known to? They were
Yes.
known to?
Wilson knew most of them, but he disapproved of them. He didn't want all these secret treaties being made, but he certainly knew about the Fiume treaty.
Okay. Because I was going to ask, how were they allowed to make secret treaties and not tell their allies or their countries that later became their allies?
Well, once we got into the war, they
divulged.
Yeah, they let Wilson know what they'd done.
Oh, good. And I also wanted to ask, because of how Wilson treated China, the US Senate refused to join Wilson's League of Nations. And I'm wondering, would US membership in the League have made a huge difference in preventing World War II or something like that?
Could you, it was a little bit of a garble. Could you ask that question again?
Well, I think in your book, you described how the fact that Wilson acquiesced to Japan in terms of Shantung in China. And for that reason, the Republicans, I believe, in the US Senate refused to give the go-ahead to joining the League of Nations.
Well, that was one of the reasons. There were others.
Okay, well, I always wonder, would the US presence in the League have made a huge difference in history, like preventing World War II?
It's very hard to say. I mean, no one would know, but certainly America not being in it made it far more toothless than it needed to have been. So I think it may not have prevented World War II, but if there was a chance, America's being out of it in the League of Nations would have been better. Mussolini had a great, do you remember the phrase from the book? Mussolini said the League of Nations is okay when sparrows fight,
Yeah.
but when eagles collide, then
Yes,
it
I
can't do
do
anything.
I do remember that. I had a couple more questions, but I'll let somebody else talk. But I just wanted to mention, I think you knew my cousin, Peter Braystrup.
Oh, Peter was one of my closest friends.
Yeah, that's,
I'm very glad to
my
hear.
maiden name is Braystrup.
Uh-huh. Well, he was a wonderful man and a very, very close friend.
And Joe will tell you, I've just had all our grandfather's Danish letters translated and made into a book.
He was a Danish chauvinist.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Remember, he always used to fly the Danish flag.
Yeah.
And my favorite memory of that is when he was going, his wife Sandy wanted to go on a roots trip to Scotland. And I said, Peter, you know, your roots too, the Danes were very big in Scotland. And Peter said, yes, they were dark, squatty people before we came.
Oh, well, I'm sorry he's not alive to read our grandfather's letters.
John
Yes.
Lodge?
John.
Hi, well, Mr. Greenway, first I would love to thank you for this book. Jock gave me a copy last spring when my son was actually doing a history term paper on his, let's see, great grandfather, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was, obviously one of Wilson's chief nemesis. But one of the questions that my son sort of came up with is he felt strongly that I mean, you could sort of say on a broader scale that hubris is followed by nemesis, and that Wilson overreached and was he had a grand vision, but he wasn't necessarily willing to do a lot of the spade work to get there. But the other thing that I think sort of interesting is the effect that some of his health issues had on him, because I mean what happened to him when he came back and tried to sell the League of Nations to the country, I think that sort of was the last of what seems like it could have been a whole series of medical things that really sort of knocked him off his game at a very critical point.
I think that's exactly right. And we can never know exactly how sick he was during the peace conference, but all his colleagues and the American team noticed that he was not well. His personality seemed to change, and he most probably had a stroke.
Yeah. Well, in my son's research, he found out that he'd had sort of a similar episode when he was the president of Princeton.
He had many little medical.
Yeah, but that while he was the president of Princeton, he had an issue which then sort of made him in his negotiations much more intractable and sort of unreasonable, and there was a little bit of a sort of a faint mirror of what ended up happening at
I think you're right.
Paris.
And we'll never. It's impossible to tell now, but
yeah, it's sort of a
I'm convinced that his illnesses affected his ability to get along with people and made him more rigid and inflexible.
Yeah.
And Lodge was willing to compromise, and the British and the French said, "Oh, look, we'd be willing to compromise a little bit," but he was absolutely determined it had to be done his way and no other way. And I'm not sure he would have done that if he had not had these little mini strokes. And
yeah. So that that sort of not that that's an excuse, but it is a sort of an issue that never really seems to come out in a lot of the criticism.
And to your point that he had the grand ideas, but wasn't able to carry through. I thought the philosopher John Dewey put that very well. He was in China at the time of the May 4th movement going on. And he said, if the United States was not going to see its ideals through, it shouldn't have professed any.
Mm.
And I think that's the tragedy.
Yep.
Frank, did you have a?
Yeah,
ahead.
very quickly, Ted mentioned the hazards of the rhetoric, but in terms of the self-determination, obviously one of our big problems in that area was the Confederacy. And with Wilson grew up, in the South, it was very much a Southerner. And how does that phrase, even today, it's resonate, whether it's Staten Island or Eastern Oregon or these other places, how do you see that sort of thing resonating now in the dangers in it as it has surfaced?
That's an interesting question. I hadn't even thought of that before. Do you think that maybe Wilson thought that the Confederacy should have succeeded?
Well, it's strange that was he not so sensitive to the limitations of the concept? Because
Yeah,
obviously there are dangers.
yeah,
And that
yeah.
was an extreme example of ripping this country apart for
Yes,
regional self-determination.
yes. Well, I don't think we're on the verge of breaking up,
No.
but we do have these people in Texas who are talking about
Yeah.
secession, and it's in the conversation.
Excuse me.
Jock,
Because
did
through
you
that,
have-
as you say, Frank, is this obviously violence that goes with it, which David tracks in each of these three instances. One thing I was curious, we talked about D'Annunzio and the consequences with Mussolini and with of course in China. I haven't talked too much about Franco and him sort of emerging in power because of that, the battle in the Rif. Could you talk about that a little bit? Because
Well,
clearly in terms
yes.
of unintended consequences, that lasted and lasted and lasted.
Well, exactly. And in an odd way, even though Abdul al-Krim lost and surrendered to the French because he knew the Spanish would hang him, he lived to see all of North Africa free.
Mhm.
But his impact was probably greater on Spain than in Morocco.
Yeah.
Because the Rif War was like Vietnam War was for us. It tore Spain in half, with some people passionately for it and some against it. But in Spain, it had even a bigger result. The king was discredited and resigned, and a republic was formed. And but the Spanish could not, like our country today, the left and the right, they didn't see each other as wrong, but each other as evil. And when that happens, democracy's in trouble. And in the election that they had in 1936, the left wing won and the right wing attempted a coup. Sound familiar? And the difference was that the army went along with the coup. And when it wasn't succeeding, they brought over the army from the Spanish army in North Africa, along with Franco.
Mhm.
And so he became the leader of the Spanish fascists. And within 6 months of the end of the Spanish Civil War, World War II started.
Right.
And interesting, Pétain, who was the French leader in Morocco fighting Abdul al-Krim, became the Vichy head of state of France. So you had the two old Africa hands running Spain and running France.
Mhm. Amazing. Mhm.
I can add a question if no one else wants to ask one, but Ho Chi Minh,
Right.
he was affected by 1919, tried to get support for his idea of an independent Vietnam, and no support was forthcoming from Wilson or anyone else. And then goes on to lead the most successful revolt against the US in the 20th century. It's just a tragedy of history, I guess, from an American perspective. But can you shed a little more light on the story of how Wilson influenced Ho Chi Minh?
Well, Ho Chi Minh was in Paris in 1919, and he wanted to see Wilson and give him this bill of particulars on why Vietnam should be free from the French and all the French misdeeds. And he borrowed a suit and dressed up to go and see Wilson, but Wilson never had time to see him, and there's no record that Wilson ever saw his Ho Chi Minh's petition.
Hmm.
But if he had, and Wilson had been a little more willing to break up colonial empires, Vietnam never would have happened.
Mhm.
Amazing.
So are there any other questions? Or this has been absolutely wonderful. Yes.
I have one more question, more of
Yep.
a contemporary question, I guess, is that, and I think, Ted, you sort of alluded to this, but, and also maybe a bit in my introduction. So we have Haiti, we have, the Taliban, Afghanistan, potentially, we have, but Estonia, Singapore, maybe an example. And so this is a book in a certain sense about nation building and the hazards that go with it and how hard it is. And as a reporter, and as we've got such experience in this, what kind of policies should we have towards some of these countries? I mean, Haiti is just such an extreme case, but how do you build a country today? Not an easy question. In 30 words or less.
You don't invade them.
You don't invade them.
Yeah. And I think the tragedy of Afghanistan was directly related to the tragedy of Vietnam, in that we went in there to try to make the Vietnamese in our image. And we went into Afghanistan saying we're going to make them into our image. And big mistake. And I just looking here for a quote from de Gaulle, who said in 1966, give me a second, it's right here. Well, I'm not going to be able to find it, but basically he said that Asia would never accept a diktat from the West, no matter how strong the West was, the Western country was, or whatever its motives. The West couldn't impose on the East. And I think that's the lesson of Vietnam. And we didn't pay attention to it. And now we have this tragedy in Afghanistan.
Great. Well, thank you.
Absolutely. Excellent. Well, great. What a wonderful, wonderful evening. I can't tell you how much we appreciate. Yes, absolutely. Great. So thank you so much for this really fabulous program, Ted and David, and thank you also to all of you for your questions and comments. We really appreciate it very much. So
I would just totally echo that David and Ted, this has been been wonderful and some very good questions. And it's just a wonderful book to read. Lisa, I'm glad you sort of noted that because it's actually fun to read. It's a reading about people that a lot of us don't know as much as we might think we do. And that whole part about Fume with that era, it sort of sounded like San Francisco in the late 1960s or the summer of love. It was just this combination of libertine and authoritarian. So it's kind of a remarkable story in that respect. And obviously Abdul Karim, and then wasn't that Sean Connery who played his role in the desert, perhaps in one of the movies?
Oh my
So
God.
there's all kind of been, diffuse. We don't really understand it. So it's just a wonderful book. And Ted, thank you for teasing out some of the great parts in it. And
I love the book. I'm so happy to be a part of it.
Thank
We
you.
have it here on sale.
yes,
I thank you. I very much enjoyed this, and thank you for the whole evening.